where he's also the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies, and also a longstanding colleague who's been thinking about and working on issues that touch on homelessness for many years. So we're thrilled to have this terrific group together. And could I just ask each of you to set the stage by saying, giving us a picture of what the last few months have been like since the COVID crisis began in your context and in your particular role. Maybe Christina, could we start with you?
Sure, thanks. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's quite early for me. So the last 3 months, from the perspective of the mayor's office, obviously there's been, intense focus on our government leaders and how they are combating this crisis and how they are reacting. I think for the city and the county of Los Angeles, it is such a complex governmental jurisdictional place before the crisis hit that we had to act very swiftly to respond. Back in March when we declared the state of emergency, and that required getting multiple system leaders in virtually in a room and really being honest about how we were going to stand up interventions that normally would take years to do, right? Standing up large scale interim housing, standing up new permanent housing. And we essentially had to do, rolling out testing in almost 1,000 encampments across the county. We had to do that in very short order. So I would say the last few months has been sort of a crash course in becoming an emergency responder. I think we all say that homelessness is the largest crisis of our time, of our generation, and we should treat it as such. I think we've been acting with that level of urgency. But this is truly a crisis. This is truly the moment in which we're being tested on how nimble we can be, how flexible, how little sleep we can function on. And it's been a really interesting experience, again, just to pull together the worlds of the homeless service system, government leadership, and then this overlay of emergency response management. And I think it's been, and I hate to say the pandemic has been an opportunity. I think that is, that's not something we should ever say lightly, but it has shown us, particularly here in LA, what we are capable of doing, where if the pandemic hadn't hit, we probably would have continued to say, oh, that's impossible. Oh, we can't do that in just a few weeks. But it's shown us that we can. And I think that's been probably the most transformative experience for our homeless service system here in Los Angeles.
Great, thank you, Christina. And maybe I'll turn to Paul now and this idea of like complexity and having to just be on emergency footing. Paul, just before the pandemic, you had epic floods in your region. And so give us a sense of how you've been managing and the issues that have been most urgent for you.
Thanks, Roseanne, and good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that might be US-based, Monmouthshire is a large Welsh unitary council, I guess the equivalent of one of your state levels of administration. My role within it in US terms is probably close to being chief of staff. So my side of the operation isn't political, it's official. But as Roseanne says, it's been a very interesting year. Interesting is a good word, isn't it? Somebody once said to me that it's got about 18 different definitions, and I think we've exhausted them all. Yeah, yes, just before we got into the COVID space, we were coming off the back of the worst floods that our region has seen in 100 years. So we were within centimeters, inches, depending on your preferred sort of instrument of measurement, of losing whole towns to water. We had emergency centers set up. We had quite a lot of things going on. And this was happening at the time that the Wuhan sort of outbreak was being declared. WHO were declaring sort of global pandemics. So I guess it's worthwhile we remind each other that whilst COVID has been an epic venture, it hit us at a time when we had other dynamics in play as well. I don't think there's a manager or a leader in public sector, probably anywhere in the world at the moment, that has the luxury of being focused on just one thing. For us, it's been a real test of our adaptive leadership. This has not been a technical managerial challenge in any way, shape or form. There have been aspects to that, but I think the challenge has been very, very different. It's been a test of our power of purpose. It's been a test of our political clarity. It's been a test of our ability to, I guess, stay smaller than the problem that we're looking to confront and to overcome. But it's going to be interesting to get some international comparison, because for me, probably the biggest challenge has been to sense make this as a reality that changes, or certainly in the early days was changing by the day. You know, we were confronted with a set of emotions ranging from fear, anxiety, anger, disbelief, and I guess it fell to us to try and make sense of those emotions for a population which, you know, is not homogenous. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of different worldviews. The technical challenge of closing things down and the pace that we did it, you know, we can talk about that if you're interested. But I think the greater challenge, Roseanne, was to actually be a voice of honesty, of credibility, and of trust. Equally, in the UK, we exist in quite a complex governmental sort of sphere. We've got a UK level of government. Within Wales, we have a devolved sort of national government. And as I say, I work at a level of county, state in US terms. And I think the events of the last sort of 3 or 4 months have reminded me that when push comes to shove, the population, the citizenry actually do trust government in the UK. They actually know that we're not out to rip them off. And they really were looking, I think, to their council, their local instrument of democracy, to tell them the truth, to communicate openly and honestly, and to provide genuine community leadership. So for me, I can talk details as we develop it out, but the context of anger and anxiety required a good degree of honesty and candidness to flesh out some different worldviews and give us the chance as a county of moving through these troubled times together. And I would suggest that to a large degree that's been successful. So that would be my opening remark, Roseanne.
Paul, thank you. And we'll return to this theme you've raised of political clarity, trust, you know, where citizens look to, and you know, the role each of us have found ourselves playing and needing to play there. But Jason, could we turn to you for an overview of what your work and your context has been like in Seattle over the last few months?
Sure. Good morning from Seattle. Good to be with you all. Just for a little bit of context, I am serving as director of the Human Services Department, and HSD is a department we operate mostly as a funder. We invest about $200 million annually in community-based organizations, really focused on ensuring citywide safety, health, and affordability through or by combating poverty, hunger, violence, and homelessness. And you know, also just for a bit of context, last year at our unsheltered census, we saw just over 12,000 people experiencing homelessness across our county. 47% of those are living unsheltered, and roughly 3,500 are living unsheltered in the city of Seattle. So during this COVID-19 pandemic, beginning here in Seattle in late February, our work has become more essential and more critical than ever before. I mean, we've had to radically change our shelter, housing, outreach, food, meal, behavioral, and medical health and hygiene services across the city and had to stand up services that we've never had in place before, like isolation and quarantine centers for people who don't have the ability to isolate or quarantine in their own homes or in a congregate shelter setting. We also had to stand up very quickly recovery centers after hearing that countries across the globe were really running out of hospital space and needed to ensure that people had a safe place to recover, especially if they didn't have the ability to do that in their own home. And I think the leadership challenge for me personally has been that while the Human Services Department does a lot, we also don't own any property. I don't manage or have authority over public health. I don't have any oversight or direction over behavioral and medical healthcare systems. And so my role over these past few months has really been to kind of ensure that I and the department are leading with partners from the county, with partners from public health, partners at our emergency operations center at the state level, really trying to understand how to access resources at the federal level, and do that in a way that is ideally coordinated, but ultimately in a way that's serving Seattle's most vulnerable residents. And I think that has offered a real opportunity, but also a challenge to lean in on the network of personal and professional relationships that we've all developed, and really, I think, highlight the incredible value of that network of professionals in government, in community-based organizations, in order to combat this pandemic. Impossible to be able to do it alone.
And also this theme of leading without control, but through relationships, through influence, through creating a network structure to accomplish a common purpose. Eager to return to that as well. And Jeremy, we've had 3 local perspectives. You are the advisor nationwide to the UK's homelessness efforts. Could you give us a sense of what that seat has felt like?
Yeah, thanks very much, Roseanne. And just apologies for the gaudy backcloth here. I'm in my daughter's room, and which is the most convenient room to use. And she's a bit of an old hippie, or a young hippie actually. She's 28, and she is in Mexico. And about 5 weeks ago, she got COVID-19. So she's actually got infected. And I only mention this in the sense that, in terms of personal feelings, we're all going through quite a lot, aren't we, as we do this? So it's not only a matter of dealing with the situation as we see it for our countries, but also that kind of immense personal pressure that you feel. And I think the most difficult times for me in the last few months have been almost being frightened about the decision you're making, because you can make a decision that if it's the wrong one could leave people dying. But in terms of my own personal working life, I was busy advising the government as an expert advisor through my background in the homelessness sector. And to be self-critical, although I could see, or we could see, that what was approaching us in terms of the information we were getting from Italy and Spain, the numbers going up, there was a week when it still felt, looking back, it was business as usual too much. And in that week, an old friend of mine, Dame Louise Casey, who you know well, Roseanne, said, we need to do something different here. And we got together and we formed what became the task force, which is the body driving the efforts around COVID-19 in England, in the UK. And I think I remember when it started, I then worked 15 straight days, so right through the way to the weekend. And essentially what we were doing was getting everybody in. And that became the slogan of the government's response, everyone in. And we asked local authorities to actually bring every rough sleeper inside. And this may seem a simple thing to do, but the messaging had to be very direct, and it's exactly what local authorities did. It was a fantastic effort. The local leadership was astonishing, and 90% of rough sleepers came inside, mostly into hotels, which were block booked in the way I know they have been in the US. I learned a massive amount from health colleagues. So what happened during this time was, I think that it brought together previously siloed parts of the system to work together. Everybody was enormously driven. It was very moving seeing what was happening in terms of people coming in. And of course, in human terms, we were seeing people take the offer of coming into a hotel who had not only turned down offers of accommodation for days or weeks, but literally for years. And a combination of massive fear, the opportunity of moving straight into a hotel, and probably the declining of street activity on the streets of our cities in particular. So the begging was no longer around as lucrative as it was. The soup runs that come onto the streets are also not there. So there were reasons for not being on the street. People came in, and that was incredibly successful. We then at the stage when we had to be moving people on from that accommodation into other accommodations. So it suddenly seemed that getting people in was the easy part. How do you make sure people don't return? How do you move them on into other interim accommodation? Most importantly, how do you seize the opportunity and bring them into long-term accommodation? So that's been the challenge. I think probably the most important moment for me came in early July, when we were all waiting for the death statistics to come out. And we call them that, the death statistics. They're produced by an independent body, and they were investigating how many people have died of COVID-19 in the homelessness population. And those numbers came through, and it was 16 people, 16. And at that point, we all treated ourselves to get a bit emotional, to be honest, because you can have as many policies and procedures as you like and objectives, but ultimately, if you can come in with 16 people only dying, always in the context of that being 16 people too many, but that made it feel absolutely worth all that effort. So I think that was the moment, the uplifting moment. The demoralizing moments are when you just don't feel you're moving at the speed you need to. And also, castigating yourself sometimes, looking back thinking, why did we take so long to get to the point we're at now? Because as has been noted by colleagues, out of this terrible, terrible thing has arisen different ways of working and opportunities that we probably should have been more eager to engage in before. So yeah, it's been an amazing time, both in terms of it being very depressing at the moments and very exhilarating.
Jeremy, thank you. And I hope your daughter is recovering well. That was an alarming bit of news that you introduced your remarks with. So sending best wishes.
She's doing well, Roseanne, and she's also working for Invisible People in the States.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, Mark
Terrific. Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Jeremy, thank you for really bringing kind of the policy and the human and the decision-making challenges all together in that way. And turning to Robert, Paul had mentioned this role of sense-making while things are still in such turmoil. And Robert, you're in a situation of not just leading a vital policy institution, but your job is sense making and turning that into policy. And would love to know, both from the perspective of your leadership challenges or context at American Enterprise Institute, but what are the policy themes that you're already seeing emerge, and how are you processing those questions in real time?
Well, thanks, Roseanne. And I have to say, I'm a little bit humbled to be on this panel, because while I used to be in the social services sector and have played some role in responding to very serious emergencies at 9/11 in New York when I worked for Governor Pataki, and in Superstorm Sandy when I worked for Michael Bloomberg and ran the Human Services Agency in the city at that time, I'm not really on the front lines like these other people are. And I greatly admire their work and respect them immensely. And so I feel a little bit humbled by that. I run a small think tank that does address a lot of the issues that we're facing as a country. And I have a scholar Scott Gottlieb, who is a really prominent expert on the issue of the pandemic and on responding to the pandemic. And our role has been to make sure that while we are complying with the shutdown orders that exist in the District of Columbia where we operate, and we're protecting our 200 odd workers, we're also producing the work we need to produce in order to inform the public policy process. And so that's not anything like the challenges the other guests are facing, and I recognize that. But that's what we've been doing. Our role has been to make sure that Scott has the leeway and the time and the resources to get his view into the public discussion. And that has been effective, and Scott's been very persuasive. He takes this pandemic very seriously, and he's been warning, and he was an early warning for the people in Congress and in the White House, whether they were listening or not, this was serious. And he's been really a guider of state and localities, especially states that have consulted with him, like the state of Maryland, in their response. And when he's been listened to, my judgment is the states have made better choices. And my job really now is just to make sure that he has the leeway and the time and the energy and the resources to get his message across. I would just say that from my experience in Superstorm Sandy, when it comes to sort of dealing with a crisis of this nature, to me, they're very fundamental ingredients to making you never can solve every problem, you never can be perfect, but you have to be periodic and constant communicators. You have to always be telling what the situation is and communicating to your staff and to the public broadly. You have to recognize that this is an emergency and resources are to be used and to be marshaled. And don't think that, well, where are we going to get the money from? You just got to go. You got to make it happen and figure out how you pay for it later. It's an emergency. That's what this is. That's what those sorts of resources are for. I've always found, and I must say, it must be much harder given the conditions of the pandemic, that it was important to be present, to be at the place where the community was looking to for decisions and your staff was operating pretty much all the time. I mean, the hours in the drain, Christine, I know how you feel. During Superstorm Sandy, it was, 24-hour days over and over and over again. But leaders in our circumstance have to be there in those circumstances. And then last is just to roll up your sleeves. You got to be willing to do not just the big public policy things, but you have to actually go and be on the scene. I remember we had, and there were a number of instances in Superstorm Sandy where there were bottlenecks, where things weren't getting done at places where people were truly in desperate need for food and other resources. And that comes a time when sometimes the person who's in charge, the big executive with the suit, has to go to that community and be on that street and walking that block and seeing why is this emergency allocation of food not getting there where it should be on time. When you do that, actually, you can see that things seem to make a difference. So being willing to really get and do the granular things, the human things, and set an example is useful. But here in Washington, it's kind of complicated and difficult and chaotic and incoherent. The role of the American Enterprise Institute is to provide empirical, independent analysis of difficult problems and hope and that politicians and leaders in government are listening. And that's what we're trying to do.
Robert, thank you. And this theme, I think the nexus of decision-making that has to happen quickly with imperfect information, and then how to communicate decisions in reality. I'd just love to open up this challenge and really anyone to shed some light on a moment that one of these very consequential decisions needed to be made in the last few months, and how you got people on board with it, how you communicated it. I'd love a story or a reflection. It seemed as though all of you touched on experiences that involve those kinds of moments. Paul, how you were saying before we joined that this maintaining yeah, frankly, the trust and confidence of citizens was a key role. And yet you're probably, 2 minutes ahead of what citizens are experiencing in terms of seeing what's coming. What are some of the moments that were significant learning moments for you around this question of sense making and communication, with this awareness of the need to create, maintain, build trust?
It's a great question, Roseanne. And to start an answer, I guess I'd echo some things that Robert has just shared. To lead in this sort of space, you have to be present, you have to be visible, you have to be human, you have to be able to convey a sense of humanitarianism. You're not leading for yourself, for your own family, or for your own organization. You're leading for people that have never met you, they don't know you. So building that bond of trust and holding that bond of trust over an hour, a day, a week, a month, 6 months, where you start and how you start either makes or breaks, in my experience. And we were reminding ourselves all the time as an organization that every single person is doing their best. Even when people were getting on our nerves, even when we thought they were making wrong decisions, we knew they were doing their best. There was no malice. And I think if you travel with that as a mindset, your chances of success, in my experience, are greatly increased. And the interesting feature, I think, of this pandemic so far is that in terms of decisions, there are hundreds of them every single day. And in the moment, it sometimes can be difficult to work out which ones are crucial, actually, because they're all important. They wouldn't be making it to your top table if they weren't a decision that really mattered in some way, shape, or form. We took the position very early as an organization that we weren't going to be led by government. We weren't going to wait for guidance. We were going to act, and we were going to be prepared to act on our judgment and stand the consequence of that. We understood from the very first day that 7-10 years down the line, there are going to be public inquiries in terms of these actions conducted by people that we don't yet know. So we needed to be confident that we had a good basis for our decision, but I'm not sure yet that we've ever had a perfect evidence base for anything that we've done. But could we justify the action that we took based on what we knew, or did we want to just wait? We took the view that this was a moment to stand up as a vocational public service, and I think my colleagues have done that dramatically. So some examples very, very quickly of different sorts of decisions which were relevant, I think, for us. One was quite major, understanding quite humbly that we weren't going to do this on our own. So other sort of presenters have mentioned, and certainly Jason mentioned, the absolute importance of partnership working, networks, cashing in on relationships, and with statutory, third sector, voluntary partners. Absolutely, an absolute crux of our approach. But it's more than that. We knew that we wouldn't get through this without the citizens, without the communities. We needed community groups to stand for their areas and their towns. And the very good news for us was that before we could even ask, they were there. We had groups forming in real time. And it was very, very important that we got our first engagement right. We never asked, we never sort of took a position of this is what you can do for us. And the position we always took is, what can we do to help you? It's your town, it's your street, it's your neighborhood. We will be there when you need us to be there, and we will never leave. So we set our conditions for the long game very early, and we had a very simple strapline that we're having no gaps and no duplication in Monmouthshire. We will build a mesh which captures everything, and to do that, we need everybody within our organization, on the payroll and off the payroll. That doesn't sound like much of a decision, but actually it's proven to be a really quite a big one, because the goodwill that's created and the sheer force of human people that's created has been beyond the capability of an organization, or indeed a combination of organizations. We shut down access to national parks. We just did it because we thought it was the right thing to do. We set up emergency accommodation for homeless people. in places that perhaps some of the local residents wouldn't necessarily have wanted that accommodation. We took the view that we didn't care. We wanted people to survive. We wanted people to live, and we would have the argument later. We also took some again, what might seem to be quite small decisions, which actually weren't necessarily in line with government guidance. So, for example, we took the decision never to close our cemeteries. We wanted people to be able to continue to visit loved ones. We were, or loved ones passed. We were incredibly worried about the mental health of individuals if they had patterns of life disrupted that didn't necessarily need to be. We took the view not to close very many of our parks. We've got hundreds of parks. We took the view that if we wanted people to be active within the safe space that they were enabled to be active, we wanted to give them a place to be so. But I guess, Roseanne, the list of decisions runs to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It comes back to that issue of being present. I think being prepared to act, being prepared just to take a view based on what you know, what seems most likely. And interestingly, for a council in the UK, and again, this might be something you want to test out internationally, is that, and I think this is great credit to our local politicians, they were prepared to stand aside. We did not need to spend hours and days looking for political agreements and consensus. The freedom that was offered to the officials was significant. The way that was earned was through, I think, exemplary communication in terms of what was going on. We communicated twice a day very thoroughly with every elected politician in our space. We were communicating every single day with all of our payroll staff. We engage, there's a Welsh word, cwtch, which is embrace, hug. We set up digital cwtches with our workforce straight away. So we were engaging with all of our thousands to make sure that they understood the narrative that we were pushing for. Now with that, and we did take the time to put a framework together. We codified our purpose, we codified our design principles, we codified our values, we codified our strategic aims. That gave us a basis which made decision making, I won't say easy, but it gave us a frame. And we did that quickly, and we publicized it.
That's tremendous. I think all of us would be interested in that frame. But this point about values-based leadership, and like in the last several months, this is not the time for kind of technical problem solving. It's very much about what needs to be done here. And Christina, you started us with that that frame. I'd love to hear in the context of Los Angeles, which is so complex in terms of its layers of government and the level of need, especially among those experiencing homelessness and very vulnerable and outside. This notion of leading with values, the vocation of public service, which is a kind of a beautiful reminder of what really happens and needs to happen in these moments, and has so profoundly in many communities. But if you could share, Christina, some of your key learning moments about what is possible if you're staying within that values frame and having to make decisions, as you said earlier, that would usually take years and require all sorts of process, but just having to make decisions differently based on values.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I think, here in LA, we have the sort of collective leadership impact model, right? There are a lot of system leaders that come to one table and, together make very deliberative decisions about the health and direction of our rehousing system. And that is an invaluable structure that we have in place. And it's really necessary because, the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's incredibly important. It's interesting, though, I would say sometimes that level of consensus building and collaboration is not the most efficient way to function. And I think in a true crisis that like we are in right now, I mean, it's like the fire chief, who's fighting a fire. She's not going to ask, what burning trees she should put out with her fire hose, right? She's just going to do it because that's the life preservation mission that she's on. And so it's been this interesting tension that, that we have to be really honest about. And just as we think about leveraging relationships, sometimes, we have to, and as many of my fellow panelists have said, we have to assume that everyone is trying their best. There is no malice in the decision making. We are just trying to act with a level of urgency that that is unmatched, that is unprecedented. And so I think, there have been moments where I'm sure I have pissed off some of my colleagues that we sit at that table with together in the decisions that we've had to make quite urgently. But I think we all understand that we're all doing it for the greater good. We're all we're making decisions quickly because we have to, because it is literally life and death. And so, it's been interesting. I think some examples I can bring up, and Jason, it really resonated with me when you said, that you don't oversee public health, that these are not tools that you typically have in your toolbox. As a city, we deploy municipal city services by and large, right? We pick up your trash, and we oversee law enforcement, and we have firefighters. We don't have public health, mental health, medical services necessarily in our toolbox. And so what I think prior to the pandemic may have been seen as mission creep, when we're doing things like deploying high capacity testing sites down on Skid Row, it's just stuff what we had to do. We had to do it. We did it with our partners to the extent that we could, but sometimes we had to act and ask for permission later when it came to the actions that we were taking, just out of sheer urgency to save lives. We have, on any given night, 60,000 people who are homeless in the county of Los Angeles. We have 3 out of 4 of them who are living unsheltered. And so the urgency we had to act with to make sure we just had basic life-saving services like hygiene stations and shower trucks, and it had to happen quickly. And sometimes we were out of our lane. I know I've been out of my lane many times during the last few months, but I think leveraging the relationships that exist, so people know this isn't coming from a place of trying to sort of take over the world of public health, right? The mayor is not a public health expert. He doesn't pretend to be one, but we've all had to swiftly learn how to sort of function in this new normal. So it's been interesting in terms of just kind of learning the dynamics of how to how to be okay, how to be uncomfortable when there are things that get when there's friction.
Yeah. Christina, thank you. And I'm struck by, again, the emphasis on relationships as so key to moving forward. And Jason, you started us off there around like this responding well to a crisis is all about really leveraging the relationships in place, building new ones where necessary. But I certainly, as a leader, one of the things that involves when you're working through relationships is looking out for each other, and the mental health and morale and other family challenges that I think every leader has had to wrestle with while making decisions for a larger organization or public, maybe are sort of underreported. But I'd love to know how you've been thinking about or efforts that you've found to be important around staff morale, keeping people's mood and confidence up, just being alert to the mental health and the physical toll being in demanding roles takes on the team of people that you've assembled and that you're in relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's on my mind all the time, every day. So there are roughly 400 employees of the Human Services Department. And during this crisis, we've had to redeploy several of them. So someone who started the year in 2020 thinking that they were going to manage contracts in an office environment is now on in a food distribution hub, and helping to pack meals for homebound or homeless individuals who are staying in one of our new shelters, and or that we've moved into hotels. And it's not just the individual and what they are dealing with in managing their own life, their own family, but also significant changes in the body of work that the department is leading right now. And so I've really tried to do two things to keep morale high. And one is constant information about our COVID response. We truly are in action to save lives. And I think that, especially in the population experiencing homelessness in Seattle, King County, we really have seen that the efforts that we put in place February, March, April are working. We're seeing that flattening of the curve. We're seeing that infection rates and death rates are lower than in the general population. And so ensuring that people understand that their efforts are having an impact is really important, especially for individuals who are part of a mission-driven organization like the Human Services Department. So I do that through webinars, I do that through email, I've done video blogging. I try to, even in this environment where we're not supposed to be circulating throughout, mixing with people, I do try to be present at various different program sites to really show that I too am willing to change my work and engage in a different way, and really be with them as a team member. But the other is, even efforts like this, like I have found it as a leader really helpful and inspirational to connect with others who are doing this work across the globe. Whether it's a monthly phone call of West Coast cities, connections to cities globally through Bloomberg or other organizations, whether it's connecting with other cities and government officials and nonprofit organizations locally here in the state of Washington. It's been really helpful for me to, one, get some level of peer support and continued encouragement from colleagues, but also be able to share what's working in those communities with my team. And I think that, again, we're in this together, we're in this to make a difference, we're in this to save lives and to work differently together during this specific crisis moment, I think helps bring a motivation to my team, to the team at Public Health, to the team at King County, as well as to the teams of people who are working in the nonprofit sector to provide the services that so many need right now. So, I think it is a constant work and I'm constantly trying to figure out how I can lift morale on the team. Sometimes just yesterday, I had a team huddle with the workforce in the division that is primarily responsible for addressing homelessness citywide. And honestly, I didn't need to do anything except listen. I just needed to be present and really be an active participant in listening to their concerns, in listening to the challenges and struggles that they're experiencing as they conduct this work. While we're all leaning on relationships with one another in order to move this work forward, those tensions, those obstacles, they're all still there. And so there's, even though we're all sort of, gunning for the same outcome here, there is still interpersonal, interpolitical issues in those relationships that can sort of trip people up. And so being able to hear folks, hear what those issues are, and help create a path for a solution is helpful. And again, just yesterday, being able to just sit in space with the team and listen to them, sometimes just vent, I think is really powerful. And as a leader, we have a responsibility to be in those spaces and hear those concerns, even when they're about us, even when we are the barrier, which I learned was the case yesterday. So anyway, I think it's ongoing work, and I think any of us in leadership positions know how critical the morale of our team is, and how important it is, especially during this period.
Jason, thank you. And very true. We all experience that, just the fact there's a crisis, some of those other issues, just they don't stop. But I'd love to turn to Jeremy and Robert around this question that several of you have mentioned, which is there are things that have taken place, decisions that had to be made, opportunities that were discovered that maybe we should be taking forward, that should actually be the basis of new policy choices, of new practices, of new ways of thinking about affecting work. And so, Jeremy, I'd love to hear from you from a UK perspective, and Robert from a US perspective, about some of the learning that actually can make our communities stronger, that could be embedded in new ways of thinking and new policy choices. So, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think, a point that Paul made, I think really resonates with me, which is I think this is a time for humility amongst leaders. So far from it be a time for an all-knowing, charismatic leader, I think it's a time to recognize what we don't know. And that has really served me, and in terms of relationships with people, that recognition we're making the best decision based on the information we've got. We can't be certain it's the right one. And for me, there was a really important moment when we were getting people into the hotels about whether we were going to select as the next tranche coming in people living in communal shelters who are putting themselves at risk because they're in communal spaces, or whether we're going to bring people in from Heathrow Airport, where there were 165 rough sleepers across the 5 terminals. And suddenly you're making a decision, which is an impossible one to make because both groups are at risk and you have to get them in. And so in terms of that decision, everybody acknowledged we didn't really know. We didn't know who was most at risk, but we were going to make the best decision based on what we've got. So I do think there's a way in which we make decisions at the moment that I'd really like to hang on to, but I suspect we'll lose when we go back to whatever business as usual is and whenever that happens, because I think it's really difficult to hold on to that sense of being able to share and trust people and to recognize that we're not infallible. I think in terms of the learning, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, I'm thinking, why on earth was I spending so much time last year trying to work out? I had a joke with a colleague of mine from an organisation called Crisis, John Sparks. We were loggerheads in a group because I wanted a rough sleeping strategy and he wanted a wider homelessness strategy. And we spent quite a lot of time debating that and wasting time over that and thinking that was the most important thing in the world. And then COVID-19 comes, and John Sparks and me, we get on really well. So it's in the context of us being, feeling very committed to working with each other. But we were laughing. Why did we ever think that was important? So I do think there's a way in which we need to kind of rationalize what matters when we get back to whatever the future holds for us. And additionally, I think we probably spend too much time modeling, that whole sense of let's theoretically run around the block one more time with this issue or with this approach to see whether it's worth launching. And what I've learned is you can launch at an earlier point. You need to keep learning as you go on. You're never going to be quite happy with the information you've got, but let's go early with trying to try new things out and make sure we have a strong evidence base that we can work with when we go on. But I do think that sometimes in the past we've been a bit hamstrung by not wanting to try things out. And this crisis has really pushed us into being much more focused on the evidence we need and to say that's good enough, let's go. And the other thing that I would say, because I was thinking about how virtuous my colleagues are here in terms of the way that they behaved. I have to say that over the last few weeks, I've probably made more apologies to colleagues than I ever had in the past, and said things like, look, I'm just so tired. I've got too stressed there. I'm usually better than that. I apologize unconditionally for getting so worked up in that meeting with you. And it's interesting because everybody knows we're in a different space to what we used to hear. And there has been magnanimity in the way we've behaved towards each other. So I don't know how we capture these human qualities, but I think we're going to lose them in terms of showing the best of us. But broadly speaking, I do think in some of the ways we now set our objectives and our long-term policy objectives, there needs to be more risk-taking, and there needs to be more of an acceptance that we can take a plunge at an earlier point. Always, I'd emphasize this, always working on a strong evidence base, but being prepared to keep reflecting on that evidence base as we progress our strategies. But yeah, I sometimes now think, this time last year, what was really bothering me? Hey, no problem, don't need that anymore.
Jeremy, thank you. So wise. And Robert, love to hear from you on this question of what we should just never go back from.
Well, I've had the one sort of operational experience I've had during this pandemic is that I was asked to join Governor Hogan's task force on the response to the pandemic. And I've been very impressed by the way in which he's, and if you look at his numbers and the record and the efforts that they've done in Maryland, he's been very successful. And he's also done it in a way that's won the support of overwhelming percentage of voters in Maryland who really are appreciating the efforts he's made. And he has struggled with the balance between wanting to be very aggressive on the public health front. And like some of the other guests, I had a little interaction with the public health experts. I didn't have it totally under me. I was more on the poverty side and the public assistance side. But there is a tension there because public health demands can be quite persuasive. They're life and death, and they can really sort of play the final card that controls the decision. But there are consequences for people, their income, their ability to care for their children, their ability to get education for their children. And Governor Hogan has assembled this group, and he meets every week right on time, only for an hour, where he gets input, and he also shares his concerns and frustrations with both people who are concerned about the economy and the broader economic situation, as well as the public health experts who are also concerned about the impact on people's lives if we go too fast. And I've just felt that maybe one thing we will learn from this is to understand that public health plays a big and important and very, very sort of controlling role in some of our decision making, as it should. But we need to find ways to make sure that we can address public health concerns without completely terminating income or work opportunities for people at the very bottom of our income scale who need those opportunities. And the last thing, I think that Scott Gottlieb is going to write a book about this. I'm sure that it will come out. The thing we've struggled with in New York and around the country is hospital capacity. And the fact that we had to monitor so carefully the ability of our, enormously well-funded in some cases, but large and sophisticated healthcare system where it just didn't have enough beds and enough personnel in an emergency. We're going to need to be better at expanding in an emergency in order to meet the demands of a pandemic. And that also includes supplies and being sure that we don't go short on supplies. And we have to recognize something that experts in the field had called to our attention. No one really did anything about it. And that, I think, will be a lesson we'll learn. That this is not, I'm sad to say, I don't think that the experts believe this is going to be the last pandemic. There'll be others. And we just have to know how to, we need to be better at getting our hospital system to expand rapidly to meet an emergency demand.
You know, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but there are themes running through the conversation around public health was kind of maybe never at necessary tables, whether homelessness or economic development or economic policy, and yet we are all the world over awakening to, like, that has to be kind of almost a layer of consideration that is informing prevention strategies. We, you know, maybe the best way to have the necessary hospital capacity is to sort of own prevention as a shared responsibility, prevention of harms. Who do you, just, you know, maybe lightning round, whose job should it be to see that we are spending more of our time on preventing harms and on being prepared in a world that is, even without a pandemic to contend with, ever more complex and threatened by things that no one organization or city or country can manage alone? Who, you know, I'd love your thoughts about making prevention, you know, kind of a foreground issue. I don't know, Paul, Christina, any thoughts on that job going forward?
I'm happy to have a crack, but before I do, can I just say I'm just awed by Christina's numbers when she was sharing them earlier. When you were talking about 60,000, you know, the sheer scale of what you guys are dealing with. Scale does matter, doesn't it? You know, we sometimes focus on scope, but scale really does make a difference. So I'm just staggered by some of the things that you guys are confronting. In terms of your more direct question, Roseanne, how would I summarize it? Relationships are gold. You know, if I've been reminded of anything over the last few months, relationships are gold. Local really does work, and communities really can. So I wonder whether governments have got to spend slightly less time governing and slightly more time convening. I think it's a very different emphasis of role, but I think the prevention lies there somewhere. You know, prevention I'm a big believer in the old Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity. You do it at the lowest possible level that makes sense to do it. And my experience of the last 4 or 5 months really has reminded me that that's where you can penetrate and you can make a rapid difference. I know my organization is going to have to fundamentally reconfigure what it is going forward. I'm going to have to become a food supply agency. I don't think local government in the UK has been that for 80 or 90 years, but you know, mental health, food supply, poverty, worklessness, all these things, probably domestic violence, domestic abuse, all these things that have probably been suppressed or hidden even more so over the last sort of 3 to 4 months are going to come increasingly into focus. And I don't think the solution to these problems in real time is tying them up in a legislature that might take 3, 4 or 5 years to produce something. So I like urgency. I like risk. I like taking decisions that might not be perfectly informed, but they're informed enough to encourage action. And I think we've got to get back to good old-fashioned community development, community engagement, and really reaping what we've seen, certainly in the UK, of local people standing up for their spaces. There's a role clearly for elected officials, but I'm interested in what that balance looks like as we go forward over the next couple of years.
Yeah, Roseanne, I'll just jump in. You know, I don't have a good answer for like who should be, you know, on first when it comes to preventing harm. I will say though, no matter who it is, it needs to be explicit. Because I think sort of any sort of diffusion of responsibility is problematic. So, you know, in LA, when the crisis hit, we set up an emergency operational command structure. and everyone had a very explicit job and everyone knew exactly what everyone's explicit job was. And sometimes it was a little out of someone's lane, like the director of mental health was overseeing the planning course. And at first she was like, well, why am I doing this? I'm the director of mental health. We're like, because we all have a job to do and it has to be explicit. So I would just say that sort of that, pointing to someone and saying, this is your job, go. That's what we need moving forward. Just a clarity around an issue that sometimes lacks specific accountability and responsibility for the shared leadership structure that we function in.
Wow. I have just loved listening to you and been inspired by everything you're working on. Thank you for the time together.
Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure, thanks.
Thank you.